Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I truly hope that you are safe, happy, and healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of virtual discussions about issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, our focus is going to be on the Biden administration and North Korea, a foreign policy issue that, at least of late, has been out of the news cycle. And I think, thankfully for Joe Biden, predictions of an early challenge from Kim Jong-un have not materialized, at least yet. Maybe it's preoccupation with economic distress caused by COVID, maybe it's flood damage, maybe it's closed borders, or maybe Kim's simply waiting to determine whether or not the Biden administration is going to reach out to him. One thing is certain, though, that Kim's quiet is not a consequence of the fact that he's hung a closed for the season sign on his nuclear program. At last month's party Congress, I'm told the first since 2016, Kim Jong-un detailed quite a laundry list of weapons that North Korea was developing. Quote, ultramodern tactical nukes, hypersonic gliding flight warheads, nuclear-powered submarines, land and sea-launched ICBMs using solid fuel. Kim at that meeting admitted to little progress on the economic side, but praised his nuclear weapons program as the only tool to guarantee regime continuity and as the best lever to pry economic concessions out of a reluctant West. He called the U.S., quote, our foremost principal enemy. So what's to be done? Administrations, both Democrat and Republican, have come and gone. Answers and solutions, either interim or otherwise, to the question of stability and peace and security on the Korean peninsula, embodying a whole range of issues: Kim's nuclear weapons, tensions with South Korea, his repressive regime and human rights policies, and anxiety on the part of the U.S. and its allies, particularly South Korea and Japan. Answers and solutions have yet to be found. Despite 4 years and 3, maybe you could call them vanity summits, Trump administration leaves behind a North Korean nuclear program more problematic perhaps than ever. And the options aren't all that great, frankly, for dealing with it. More sanctions, extended deterrence to the U.S., on the part of the U.S. to its allies, more summits, secret diplomacy, playing a China card at the moment we may not have, all of the above, none of the above. So what are we trying to achieve? Is comprehensive, irreversible, verifiable nuclearization possible with North Korea, even as an aspirational goal? How important are improved relations between the U.S. and North Korea? What kind of assurances would Kim expect from the U.S. if serious progress toward denuclearization could be made? And how best do we reassure Japan and South Korea when it comes to the North Korean threat? And finally, assuming China is the key player, how do we best engage Beijing? Fortunately, I don't have to answer any of these questions today, but we have 3 extraordinarily talented panelists who I think can. Let me introduce them quickly. Sumi Terry is a senior fellow for Korea at the Center for Strategic International Studies. She was formerly a senior analyst at CIA and Asia director at the National Security Council under Presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Joel S. Wit is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center and director of the 38 North program with its wonderful website. And finally, Suzanne DiMaggio is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focuses on U.S. foreign policy toward Asia and the Middle East. She's also a board chair and co-founder of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, as well as an associate senior fellow in the Disarmament, Arms Control, and Non-Proliferation program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. 5 minutes from each of our distinguished panelists, an annoying round of questions from me, and then screen questions from the audience. Sumi, can I ask you to begin?
Yes, thank you, Aaron. You asked me to address what's going on inside North Korea, and North Korea is having a very difficult time internally. 2020 has been one of the hardest years for North Korea for some time, probably since mid 1990s. North Korea was already dealing with UN-US sanctions, then the closing of the border with China to prevent COVID. It was the first country to close the border with China since last January, suspending flights and rail services, imposing severe restrictions on domestic movement, and therefore really self-imposed economic embargo that came with that closure of the border. And then it had to deal with, as you alluded to, a series of natural disasters, back-to-back typhoons, floods, so-called triple whammy, right? So North Korea basically closed off even more completely. They're more closed off than before from the outside world. Diplomats, humanitarian workers have left the country. Foreign trade levels are now near zero. There are various reports. It's hard to tell, but various reports talking about, a country running out of sugar, cooking oil, toothpaste, cocoa, any imported stuff is really hard to get. And then in the midst of this, last month, you just talked about this. North Korea held this very rare party congress where thousands of delegates met, right? They're supposed to meet every 5 years, this party congress. One was last, 4.5 years ago. But it was kind of rare because before that, it was like a 36-year gap between 1980 and 2016. And in this party congress, Kim admitted himself that North Korea's economic plan across all sectors has failed badly due to both internal and external reasons, right? Sanctions, natural disasters, COVID, and so on. And Kim has admitted that his plans to improve the economy has been seriously delayed. It's kind of interesting to watch him acknowledge the current adversity. And while he was doing that, he talked a lot about self-sufficiency, how that they want to decrease dependence on imports. But what was concerning to me was that it was pretty apparent that they're not interested in pursuing a major economic reform, right? In fact, they talk a lot about they at least implied market crackdown and prohibiting private entrepreneurial activity. And he called for decentralizing economic power, backing government hands. And then, there's this COVID paranoia and the measures to prevent COVID. So even though the regime says there's not a single case of COVID, we don't know. As of early this month, North Korea told World Health Organization that it had no reported case of COVID. It's very hard to believe, but point is, there's no indication that North Korea is beginning to relax these preventive measures anytime soon. So this lockdown is going to continue. North Korea treats the virus as an existential crisis, basically to be avoided, because they fear, and quite rightly so, that if there is a spread of COVID, this obviously it could wreak havoc internally, since North Korea is underdeveloped in terms of healthcare infrastructure. Meanwhile, you mentioned this yourself. While this economic situation is going on in the North, we have North Korea that also has advanced nuclear missile arsenal and more nuclear missile modernization plans, right? Kim talked about, they revealed during the party congress this very ambitious plan that Kim vowed to make major investments in nuclear missile and conventional weapons program. You talked about some of that, and just really key military technology, explicit mentions of technical nuclear weapons, and so on. They rolled out this new SLBM during the parade, following the party congress, calling it the world's most powerful weapon, solid fuel ICBMs with precision targeting to nearly 10,000 miles, far enough to reach target Washington, D.C. So what we have is pretty dire economic situation with North Korea committed to continuing to expand their nuclear capability. So let me just wrap up with this. You also asked, what are Kim's core interests and where he might be headed? As you mentioned, that a lot of Korea watchers were nervous once the Biden administration came in, that there was this anxiety that North Korea might do something in the coming months, right? Because North Korea greeted both the Obama administration and Trump administration with so-called provocations. I do think that North Korea's attitudes toward Washington will just remain more or less the same. Predictably, North Korea called U.S. the largest and main enemy, right? during the Party Congress, which is not surprising. They pointed out the U.S. policy towards North Korea is not going to change no matter who is in power, and that's probably right. We'll talk about that soon. Now Kim probably wanted Trump to get reelected, but now he has to deal with the Biden administration. Their economic situation is pretty dire. What do? Do they hold off the provocation? I think there's good reasons to test and to return to a testing campaign, and with the hope that it will eventually turn to negotiation. And there are some good reasons for them not to. I do think that, I'll just wrap up with this. I do think that North Korea did leave a small window for negotiation possibility, not negotiation for denuclearization, but perhaps one that could limit their nuclear weapons in return for sanctions relief. And we'll talk about that. Thank you.
Sumi, thank you. That was a fascinating scene setter. It is remarkable, his candor and honesty for an authoritarian leader to basically admit vulnerability and weakness and essentially lay out what I think his approach to how to use nuclear weapons as a bargaining chip. It's actually quite fascinating. Suzanne, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Aaron, and greetings, everyone. Many thanks to you, Aaron, for bringing us together today. I'd also like to thank Catherine Buchanan, Carnegie's events manager, for all the magic happening behind the scenes to make this possible. So the jumping off point for my brief remarks is the following. The Biden administration has an opportunity to set the foundation for a new U.S. approach that advances stability and peace on the Korean Peninsula. How do we get there? How do we begin diplomacy? I'd like to offer several ideas for initiating the process of diplomacy with North Korea. First, while carrying out a policy review, make an early approach to the North Koreans. During his confirmation hearing, Tony Blinken made it clear that they will begin with a policy review. Of course, that makes great sense, including consulting closely with allies. It's a pragmatic starting point, but it's one that will likely take months, perhaps maybe till June, we won't hear anything. Meanwhile, there's a strong possibility that Pyongyang will make a provocative move, such as an ICBM test, during these early days of the Biden presidency in an attempt to create leverage and gain the upper hand. To head off such a scenario, I think it makes sense to signal to the North Koreans a serious interest in engaging in diplomacy before Pyongyang forces a crisis, because once that happens, then you're always in defensive mode. The goal of such outreach should be to avoid getting bogged down in a time-sucking escalatory ladder. These are signals that can be sent via quiet diplomacy. No big announcements, not taking to Twitter, thankfully. For example, communicate by reviving a direct intelligence channel, or through a third government interlocutor, or through a track 1.5 channel. There are a number of options there. It's true, Biden's immediate focus is on the collision of crises that we're facing at home, as well as a range of seemingly more immediate foreign policy threats and challenges. Given this already large agenda, there's understandably will be a resistance to expending any bandwidth or political capital on an issue as uncertain and as unforgiving as North Korea. Even so, I think a strong case can be made for being proactive. The framing shouldn't be a policy review versus early outreach. I don't think it's an either or approach. It should instead, we should do both. Second, of course, a wild card in any of this scenario gazing that we're doing is, what will North Korea do? As such, the elements of that early outreach approach that I'm advocating for should focus on a few key points that the North Koreans might react positively to. Since the failure of the Hanoi summit in February 2019, 2 years now, the North Koreans, as Sumi have stated, have pulled back. There's been no official engagement, hardly any, with the US. Talks hit an impasse, and the stalemate has been hardened by COVID-19. There's no doubt about that. So what might they respond to? I have two suggestions. One is to signal to the North Koreans that the principles of the 2018 Singapore Declaration, which was negotiated and signed by Kim Jong-un, could form the basis of building an achievable negotiating agenda. It's a one-page document. US and North Korea agreed to establish a new relationship to work together, denuclearization on the one hand and a peace regime on the other. There might be a desire to trash this document because it has Trump's name on it. I would argue against that because more importantly, it has Kim Jong-un's name on it. His name is attached to it. So by no means is it a detailed agreement or a roadmap, but if we view it as an initial statement of principles, I think it offers a solid starting point. And it also could be sort of a face saver for Kim. The second is to seek an early understanding whereby the US and South Korea would continue to suspend major military exercises if North Korea maintains its suspension on nuclear and long-range missile tests. This dual suspension could stave off any re-escalation, and it could provide the space to explore how to best restart talks. Third, as part of this communication, I think it's time to convey an intention to move away from civid towards a more realistic approach. The Libya Style approach, championed by John Bolton, has been rejected by the North Koreans. And the objective of complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization upfront is simply unachievable at this moment and in the immediate future. Beyond that, who knows? A more realistic way forward is to begin by identifying achievable goals, take an action for action approach with incremental benchmarks. The establishment of a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula, which is Pyongyang's priority, and a process for realistic denuclearization, which is our priority, should be pursued on equal footing and in phases. And I happen to think that a declaration ending the Korean War should be part of a first phase agenda through this goal. It's been 70 years, and I think it's time to move forward with that. Fourth, look to the JCPOA as a model. Notably, Tony Blinken has referenced the Iran nuclear deal as potential guidance for North Korea. It's easy to dismiss because these are two very different countries. I've traveled to both. I can attest they are. Also, the nuclear profile is very different. North Korea possesses dozens of nuclear weapons. Iran's never crossed that threshold, and Iran is a party to the NPT while North Korea isn't. Notwithstanding these important differences, I think the JCPOA experience can offer insights into how to begin engagement with an adversary with sustained diplomacy as a goal. It was an incremental approach taken with the Iranians. First, there was an interim agreement. With North Korea, we might envision a series of agreements. Talks with Iran focused on what was deemed the most serious threat, namely Iran's expanding nuclear program, not the entire array of serious issues we have with Tehran. With North Korea, we could focus on halting the priority issues of the development of new warheads and long-range missiles, slowing the production of fissile materials. Those make sense as first objectives. And as in the case of Iran, the key goal with North Korea would be getting an on-the-ground intrusive monitoring and inspection system 24/7. From this perspective, the JCPOA is a distrust and verify model to emulate. Another element I would emphasize that was critical to the success of the Iran deal was the engagement track in which Obama authorized senior US officials to participate in secret diplomatic exchanges with their counterparts. This was an under-the-radar dialogue, and it paved the way to formal negotiations within a broader multilateral context. These discrete discussions began in July 2012 in Muscat. The Omanis served as the third-party facilitator. It seems to me we would benefit from some model like this, talks about talks, where we can clarify objectives, intentions, common interests, and red lines. So to wrap up, I mean, with all of the urgent priorities on Biden's plate, the administration might be less than excited about pursuing a proactive approach to North Korea. But one key lesson we've learned over time is that the longer we kick this can down the road, the more limited our options become. And given the tenuous communications channels, we could easily slip back into ratcheting up hostilities very quickly. So preventing such a scenario should be a priority. So following the pageantry of 2 summits and a handshake at the DMZ, time is right to focus on serious diplomacy to deal with the uncertainties ahead and attempt to manage and perhaps maybe even resolve some difficult issues. Thank you.
Suzanne, thanks. You've given us a lot to think about. And I mean, it's an intriguing notion. In order to, I mean, there are transformations in diplomacy are very rare. Diplomatic life's usually about transactions. But in this case, what you're proposing is a series of pragmatic transactional steps, which might set the stage for something, some more profound political change between the two. Joel, let me turn to you now.
Thanks, Aaron. And thanks for inviting me to participate in this event. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach from my 2 colleagues. I'm going to sort of take a bird's eye view and a worm's eye view of what I think the United States should do. And the key word for me is strategy. What should be our strategy for dealing with North Korea? You know, often these kinds of discussions are centered around engagement or not engagement, but I think that misses the point. What we need to do is step back and think about the strategy. What are we trying to achieve? So let me make 3 points. First, I think one of the biggest challenges facing us today is the erosion of our alliances in Northeast Asia. And to prevent the nuclearization of the region, most people aren't focused on that, but I think it's a lot closer than most people realize. And the triggering mechanism here is North Korea's continued development of long-range missiles and more powerful nuclear weapons. It's eroding our umbrella, protecting South Korea. And I believe we are heading for a South Korean request to either redeploy tactical nuclear weapons to the peninsula. And if we don't do that, they might even consider building their own. A lot of people are going to think, well, gee, that sounds really futuristic. It's not going to happen anytime soon. But I would point out that at the end of 2016, the Park administration was very close to making a request to the Obama administration that it redeploy tactical nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula because of North Korea's testing. This could happen again if North Korea resumes ICBM tests, hydrogen bomb tests, and that in turn has severe consequences for peace and stability in the region. Point number 2. If we're going to try to prevent this, what should we be doing? Of course, we can take steps on the military front to try to bolster the alliance, but how should this development drive our policy towards Pyongyang, and particularly our diplomacy with North Korea? You hear a lot of talk about what kind of agreements we should seek with North Korea. You know, denuclearization, phased approach. I agree with the phased approach. I don't think immediate denuclearization was ever in the cards. So it's sort of a fantasy that was never going to happen. But even in a phased approach, there have been significant differences. And I think those significant differences come from not recognizing the big problem we're facing that I've just laid out. Mm. So what I would say is our diplomacy needs to deal with that danger. And by that, I mean seeking an initial agreement that, as Suzanne has said, stops testing, nuclear tests, missile tests, maybe in a more permanent way than President Trump accomplished, And second, dismantling North Korea's key nuclear facility at Yongbyon. A lot of people will say, well, gee, why do we want to do that? That place, you know, it's old, it's decrepit, there's not much going on there. But in fact, that's where North Korea produces isotopes for hydrogen bombs. And we want to stop that activity. All of this has to be done in the context of denuclearization. I agree. We need to keep that as at least an aspirational goal, if only because the North Koreans are willing to do that too. I'm not saying we'll ever get there, but it's a funny thing about diplomacy. Goals change over time depending upon how diplomacy takes hold, and it can change what people want to do. So I think we need to keep that in the mix. Another issue that comes up with our strategy is sanctions. That should also be part of the mix, but I think we're making a serious mistake if we think we're going to pressure North Korea to make concessions at the negotiating table. We can keep the sanctions we have, we can tighten them, but we're never going to get to the point where they'll put this kind of pressure on North Korea because of a stubborn factor, China. Any sanctions on North Korea that are going to put that much pressure on them have to sanction Chinese businesses.
Yeah.
And we're not going to do that. You know, I don't care what sanctions experts say. So sanctions, in effect, give us a lot of positive leverage in dealing with the North Koreans, and we should be willing to use that. I think we hesitate because we think we're going to be able to ramp it up, and we're not. Third and last point, the United States and South Korea should be taking the lead in dealing with Pyongyang, and others, including China, should be, at best, supporting actors. In the past, Washington and Seoul have had a tag team strategy dealing with North Korea. I think that's worked very well. South Korea deals with issues of peace on the peninsula. We deal with WMD. We can do that in many different ways, as Suzanne has laid out. I think what we need is to pull out all the stops, all the diplomatic stops. And so I'm not just talking about mid-level State Department officials flying off to meet with mid-level North Korean officials. I'm talking about everything up to and including the Secretary of State getting involved in this issue. Not the president yet, but at some point, yes. There's no reason why the Secretary of State or senior officials like him shouldn't be talking to the North Koreans. And I second what Suzanne said about reactivating an active intelligence channel. For Iran, that channel was very active during the Obama administration. For North Korea, intelligence officials flew off to Pyongyang once a year to meet with the North Koreans, came home empty-handed. Well, why do you think they came home empty-handed? It didn't seem very serious. One last point on multilateral talks, I think they need to be downgraded. I'm not saying they should be eliminated, but they should just be a venue where Americans, South Koreans, North Koreans can meet, and others can meet as well and consult with each other. And that gets to the role of China. I think successive American administrations have made the mistake of thinking that China is going to solve this problem for us. And they aren't. It's just not going to happen. It's not in their interest. We're not going to convince them to change their minds. So I think our approach with China should be to make sure they do no harm, and largely by keeping them in the loop about what's going on. So I hope all of this will be part of the Biden administration's policy review. And I also second the notion that they can't take months to work through all these issues. They need to really move forward quickly on this. Thanks. I think I'll just stop there.
Thanks, Joel. You've obviously identified what I think is the core question. If you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And the question is not just engagement. It's engagement with some sort of strategic focus. I want to start where we began with you, Sumi. Tip O'Neill famously said that all politics were local. And I'm just wondering, in your analysis of the internal situation in North Korea, I wonder if you could comment on the issue of what kind of constraints does Kim Jong-un face? All leaders, even authoritarian ones, have their politics. And I've heard all kinds of reports about the fact that he's encumbered to the military, that making concessions to the West somehow will undermine his political credibility at home. So I guess that's my first question to you. Is he under constraint at home? And from whom?
I don't, there's always been this theory about hardliners, more hardliners in North Korea, like the military versus more moderates. I don't necessarily buy the argument that Kim Jong-un is constrained by other folks. I mean, he has purged and purged a lot of people and got rid of a lot of powerful people, including people like Chang Sung-taek. And, he has surrounded himself with the loyalists. So I don't necessarily see Kim Jong-un's interest being different from regime interests. When I mean by regime in North Korea, I mean the elites. I think they do have, their fate is tied. So I don't see necessarily, somebody or a person domestically being able to constrain him. Look, I think it's in their interest to keep the nuclear weapons. That's the problem. We watch now North Korea for 70 years. We have some 30 years of negotiating with North Korea. Last 10 years dealing with Kim Jong-un. So when it comes to their core interests and their strategies and objectives, his and the elite's objective remains the same. They seek to normalize its nuclear status and get accepted by international community as a reasonable nuclear weapons power. They have different tactics they employ, but I believe that by and large, their strategy is the same. Now, it does not mean we should not negotiate. My colleagues just made a great point. And we need to continue to figure out if there is a way to talk to North Koreans and see what realistically can be done. But let's not fool ourselves and think that, denuclearization is necessarily in the cards. I don't think we should get rid of it. We need to definitely still have it even as an aspirational goal, as Joel talked about. But we need to be realistic of this fact. But to answer your question, I don't think necessarily there are people or things like institutions that are constraining him. They have an interest to have nuclear weapons and get accepted by the international community as a responsible nuclear weapons power.
Right. I mean, having been a veteran of the U.S. intelligence community at the Department of State and INR, I'm a great believer that good analysis leads to good policy. But I'm wondering, because I hear from everyone, that North Korea is a very opaque place. And I have a great deal of faith in the U.S. intelligence community, but I'll ask the three of you and Suzanne and Joel, it's a very simple question. Do we really have a sense of what's going on internally in North Korea?
So,
I'm sorry. I was just going to make a brief point. I was in an event yesterday where one of my fellow panelists sort of outlined a series of questions that had to be answered about North Korea, about Kim Jong-un, about what they want, what they think, what's going on. Series of questions that had to be answered for the Biden administration in order for the Biden administration to formulate a policy. And Sumi probably understands, and I certainly understand, having been at the other end of policy making, no one's going to be able to answer these questions. That,
Right.
for every question, there would be two different viewpoints. And I think that's the point here, that, we can try to answer these questions, but we always have to keep in mind what's our national interest.
Right.
And that's what diplomacy does. I mean, sitting and talking to North Koreans or anyone else for hours at a time, as Suzanne has done, helps you understand them better. And that's what we need.
Yeah, can I chime in there?
Yes.
So I'm not advocating engagement for engagement's sake. I'm advocating for to advance key U.S. strategic interests, as a couple of which Joel laid out quite well, and I agree with. But I also advocate engagement as an intelligence gathering mechanism, to be frank. And Joel's right. I mean, one of the reasons I do like going to North Korea is meeting and sitting with North Korean policymakers where they sit. Going to their office, what do they see out their window every day? Those are the sorts of things I want to know. How do they see their world? How do they see their role in it? I think we need to better understand their threat perceptions in order to make better policy. For example, had Trump understood North Korea, Kim Jong-un, his buddies' threat perceptions, he would have never went for the Bolton endorsed Libya model. There was a lack of understanding there. It was never going to work. It was a non-starter from the start. So I really think engagement to better get to know, especially in adversaries as like North Korea.
You're mentioning Donald Trump is a good segue into my next question. Is it fair to say that Trump's notion, whether it was his or whether I'm simply describing two summits and a handshake, that it was time to start talking to North Korea rather than about North Korea, is a valid sort of view? Now, whether it's done at the level of the summit or secretly or through cutouts, or with the aid and benefit of allies, but it strikes me as almost elemental that if, in the case of an authoritarian figure who ultimately has the capacity and the power and the authority to make decisions, that if in fact your plan is to deal with decision makers who really can't make decisions, how do you structure a diplomatic process when in fact there's only one person who ultimately holds the key to whether it's a yes or a no? Mm-hmm. And that's in the case of Kim Jong-un, I think that would be very problematic. So the summit approach, maybe its sequence was wrong.
Yeah, I actually do endorse the idea of not ruling out a summit between Biden and Kim Jong-un. The decision to directly engage him, I think, was the right one. But I'd give Trump zero credit because his approach was executed so incompetently. But it's clear that personality-driven diplomacy resonated with Kim Jong-un. I think it signaled to him the U.S. was ready at the very highest level to forge a new kind of relationship. But it never gained traction because the key ingredients were missing. It was not backed by a coherent strategy. It was really the whims of our president. There was no unified and empowered negotiating team. In fact, as we've learned through Woodward's book and other writings, and through Bolton himself, is they were working at cross purposes with each other. And finally, there were no realistic goals on denuclearization, which I think we've already tackled in this discussion. So I hope the act of meeting adversaries carries over to the Biden administration, but that it's done in a responsible, smart way, that it actually advances our interests. Now, in the case of Biden and Kim meeting, I think a good prerequisite would be a good way forward would be to try to revisit the Yongbyon agreement, which Joel just talked about. The North Koreans insisted that we lift the 5 major economic sets of sanctions. I think that was a starting point for them. So I think revisiting that, the ingredients of that deal were left on the table in Hanoi. We should try to revive them, work them out in advance. And if we're able to, that would be perhaps a opportunity for a first summit, a deal that's been thought out and agreed to in advance before they meet. I would endorse that plan.
Yeah, summits are usually good for one of two things: starting a process procedurally and or concluding one. And Trump summits got lost in the middle somewhere. Joel or Sumi, did you want to make a comment on summit diplomacy?
Well, I mean, I'm not opposed to that in theory. But I think so. I agree with a lot of what Suzanne said. I mean, it's just the way it was executed. There was no discipline whatsoever. I mean, Bolton talked about it himself, as others. I think the Biden administration, but to be realistic, I'm not sure if that's what they'll be interested in. Biden already said that this is not going to be his priority. I do think they will be open to seeing whether it will be in the U.S. interest, and this will come out in the North Korea policy review, that whether it's in the interest to pursue negotiation that will at least result in an interim freeze deal, which will seek to limit North Korea's nuclear weapons capability without actually eliminating them. This will be the key. The problem is, though, when you saw at the Party Congress and what Kim's been saying, North Korea has made it pretty clear that they are not ready to make any serious concessions. So, right, that was a key message during the Party Congress, was that if U.S. is not willing to deal with North Korea on their terms, well, they got plans, this whole modernization plan, and that Kim Jong-un himself said time is on their side and not on the side of the United States. So that's what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned that it's going to lead to further impasse because of where North Korea is, where the Biden administration is, and that even if they're interested in an interim deal, I don't think they're going to give some sort of sanctions relief or early on. So I just feel that realistically, I'm just not sure if we're going to get there. So I don't feel too optimistic about it.
Let's switch to Biden for a minute.
Can I just add a quick?
Go ahead, Joel.
I'm sorry.
Sure.
I'm sorry. Look, I think I have a somewhat different perspective. In 25 years of talking to North Koreans, it's almost never that they telegraph concessions or flexibility ahead of time.
Yeah.
That's just not their style. So, I don't take what's said at the Party Congress as written in stone at all. Secondly, and I'll just say this very quickly, I'm writing a book about the history of U.S. dealing with North Korea. And the problem has been for 30 years that administration after administration has said when it comes into office, we have other priorities. These are our other priorities. And they haven't paid much attention to North Korea, and they've all regretted it later on. So I'm wondering, when can we break this cycle?
This is, to me, since urgency is a necessary prerequisite of any successful negotiation. And urgency is usually driven by the prospects of pain on one hand, and or the prospects of gain on the other. If you don't have pain and you don't have gain, what you have essentially is the status quo. And you now have an administration that is facing the greatest challenge of domestic recovery of any president since Franklin Roosevelt. And if governing is about choosing, this administration has to make some fundamental choices. And it's a paradox, because the one choice they have made in the issue of non-proliferation, in addition to extending New START with the Russians, is, I suspect, given Tony Blinken's comments yesterday about the pathway for diplomacy is open with Iran, that they've made a choice. And the question is, North Korea, a conflict on the Korean peninsula would be a global altering event. The Middle East probably, and I don't want to be cavalier about this, could probably withstand some sort of Israeli-Iranian conflict, and maybe even a U.S. military strike if it came to that. And yet, the one situation that you would think would generate, I mean, Japan, China, South Korea, tremendous economic entities, the prospects of stability, the use of nuclear weapons. Why is there no urgency? Is it just too hard?
I think it is very, very hard, and it does require a real commitment at the highest level, as we saw with the Iran deal. That was a commitment made by President Obama himself. And there was a joke that President Obama was like the Iran desk officer. That's how much time he spent thinking about it. So you do need a high level commitment. And given the collision of crises that you just mentioned, it makes sense that the Biden team will be, this is too much. But I think it's how if they frame it a different way, yes, the way you framed it, Aaron, this would not just be a spat. This would be a broader regional war, and perhaps even beyond. And then, think about how the Biden team is looking at foreign policy. One Biden advisor put it this way. He said that even on those issues that don't have an obvious domestic nexus, such as nuclear threats from North Korea and Iran, part of the metric for judging policy success will be what this is doing for the American people, American workers, and American families. So that's the challenge here, is how do we frame, what's the narrative on North Korea? Why should this administration care about it? From within that context, I think a strong case could be made that keeping this ongoing, conflict from growing, from escalating, from becoming a bigger crisis than it is in the interest of the American public. And to do it through diplomacy, I think, is the way to do it. So that is the challenge, I think not only with North Korea, but other issues too. How is the Biden administration going to communicate to the broader American public why focusing time, resources, and energy on these issues should matter to them?
Yeah.
Aaron, the good news is that we have really experienced people in the right place, right? I mean, Jake Sullivan, Bill Burns, Tony Blinken, they know this issue. I just think that the reason why it's like you hit the nail on the head. North Korea, this is a really difficult issue. Let's get real about this. I mean, I think again, we need to explore engagement on that. But even Bill Burns held out JCPOA as a possible model, right, for a possible nuclear freeze agreement with North Korea. And in fact, it's the only model we have. That's fine. But realistically, asking North Korea to join this kind of like JCPOA kind of arrangement is unrealistic, right? It still does not mean we cannot explore it, but we need to understand what the challenges are. We know that it's very unlikely, Suzanne herself said, right, that North Korea will accede to the kind of agreement they would, they could, it's not like they could agree to something like, the kind of very intrusive inspection arrangements that Iran has agreed to. They know that North Korea is not going to agree to something like that, right? They don't really actually even have a negotiating team, I don't think, could deal with, like the Iran did, have that kind of Western educated elites that Iran has. So it's just the challenges are enormous. I think by addressing and talking about that, it doesn't mean that we're not for negotiation and engagement, but we just need to talk about how difficult the North Korean situation is, and it's different from Iran.
See, this is the kick the can down the road argument that every administration has grappled with, and that's how we're here, how we got here.
Right. Let me put a fine point on it. A question that Robert Manning has asked. He's a veteran on these matters. He's asked on Twitter, Kim has made it clear he's committed to North Korea being a nuclear state. I mean, they are a de facto nuclear weapon state. what basis is there for thinking that a credible deal, even for a freeze, is doable? And why, and this is the core question we're asking, Bob asks, why should Biden make a big political diplomatic investment in it? That basically, it seems to me, is the core question. And if you add to that the fundamental difference between the Iranian situation and North Korea is that there's really no Israel out there to influence in a real-time, urgent way the calculations either of the administration or Iran. I mean, you have Japan and you have South Korea, but you really could be facing the significant possibility of an Iranian-Israeli, conflict if the Iranian nuclear agreement isn't somehow, if diplomacy doesn't resume and an acceptable set of arrangements could be made, whether it's JCPOA minus or JCPOA plus. So it all comes back, and Joel, I'm glad you're back with us, to the question that Sue Me poses. Why should the Biden, I mean, I could answer the question. North Korea is a huge potential risk through miscalculation, misunderstanding, an accident. I mean, who knows? That's the core question. And I'm not terribly upbeat and optimistic about the fact, given what's on Biden's plate, that he's going to rush into this. Joel, did you, I don't know if you heard any of that. Bob Manning asked, why should Kim, who's already said he doesn't want to give up his nuclear weapons, want to agree to a interim sort of freeze for sanctions relief set of arrangements? That is the core question, though.
Well, look, he may not. I mean, I can't guarantee what's going to happen in a negotiation, but that's what diplomacy is about. Sitting and talking and seeing what's possible. So what should we do? Should we sort of preemptively give in and say, well, gee, this is impossible, let's move on, and we'll deal with the security consequences as they happen? Or should we say, gee, we really do need to sit down and figure out what's possible and what isn't? The only way to do that is face to face.
Yeah. I mean, there is
also one more point is, let's be clear, Kim has left denuclearization on the agenda. Also in the Panmunjom Declaration with the South Koreans, it's featured there too. So why would we take something off the agenda that he has put on and agreed to? Of course, we need to explore it for all the reasons we talked about, and full-on denuclearization is a fantasy. But are there other things we could discuss in the realm of denuclearization that could move forward? And even non-proliferation. Could we get to a talk with the North Koreans to get assurances that they won't sell fissile material, nuclear technology? These are the things I think we can have conversations with them about if we get past CIVID.
Yeah, I'm all for talking. I mean, the talking cure is certainly better than the alternatives in the North Korean case. We have a question from Michael. Intriguing. I just wonder what you think. Kim has not acknowledged that a single case of COVID in North Korea, but Michael asks, is there a COVID diplomacy opportunity for the Biden administration to reach out to the North? If there's no COVID, of course, in North Korea, there's no need for
right. There's still saying there's not a single confirmed case of COVID, so it's hard. And the South Koreans try to reach out to North Korea on issues like COVID-19, but the North Koreans criticize South Korea for focusing on non-fundamental issues like COVID, and they've been really, in a way, mean to South Korea. I don't think, as in theory, it's possible. I mean, we know that North Korea is concerned and paranoid about COVID. We know that they're interested in getting vaccines, right? They try to hack into vaccine companies. But but fundamentally, I don't think that really moves us to, in terms of this kind of denuclearization talks process. But yeah, I mean, this is something to talk about, think about, only in the sense that I do know that North Koreans are concerned about the vaccines.
Right.
Well, the Biden team has fortunately already announced that it is reviewing sanctions in the context of the pandemic and a humanitarian approach. And of course, North Korea is going to be looked at in that sense, and Iran, of course, and others. So that's already been announced, and I think that's a welcome direction to move in. Now, even if the cases are zero or very low in North Korea, they are going to need vaccines if they're going to want to open up. I just read last week that they're sending 10,000 North Korean workers across the border to Russia. So that indicates maybe they have it under control, but ultimately they will need vaccines. And I think they have applied to COVAX, which is the international mechanism for vaccines, Gavi and WHO. So that's another opportunity to engage with them on these issues as well.
Let me ask the three of you a question. If security and stability on the Korean Peninsula is the real objective, and you could figure out a way to help facilitate not just a dialogue between the North and South, but a permanent set of arrangements that could conceivably bring about a formal end to the Korean War, create political, cultural, economic contacts. If you could find a way to reassure South Korea and Japan through extended deterrence, and finally, if you could figure out a way to somehow, in an interim sense, freeze ICBM development and maybe roll back some of North Korea's nuclear capacity, does it really matter that North Korea would retain nuclear weapons? I mean, I know it matters, but how much does it matter? If all these things could be achieved, could we accept Kim as North Korea as a de facto nuclear weapons state? I mean, frankly, I don't think we're going to have much choice. I could ask the three of you, if you were Kim Jong-un, what would your view of nuclear weapons be? I think I know what my view would be. And it wouldn't be to put them in a FedEx box and ship them out of the country. So if you could get all these things, could you see accepting North Korea as a de facto nuclear? I mean, they'd have to agree, obviously, to inspections and the like, but is that beyond our capacity to accept?
I don't, look, I don't think we need to accept them. We just need to understand that they will be
right.
a de facto nuclear state. We're not going to accept them as one. And what I would say is that, first of all, if we could accomplish everything that you just laid out, which would be quite a bit, we're way ahead of the game. And secondly, we should keep pushing, understanding that if we accomplished everything you've laid out, maybe perceptions are going to change on the Korean Peninsula. Maybe the situation is going to change. It's not going to be the same as today. And if the security situation changes, maybe countries' goals will change. It's a big maybe, I get it, but that's the point of trying to move down this road, is to take the temperature at every step of the way to see if things are changing.
No, it's a telling point, Joel. And if you add to my mix the prospects of a U.S.-North Korean relationship of some kind, although there is the human rights issue to be dealt with, it's conceivable you could see that. All right, I have time for one more question. All it requires is a yes or no answer. We're about to run out of time, but I'm going to ask it. Do you believe that in the next several years, the Biden administration will be able to create a diplomatic approach to North Korea, forget where it goes, that has real traction with real credibility and offers at least a way station toward peace and security and stability on the peninsula? Suzanne, yes or no?
Yes, it's going to be tough, but yes, I do.
Sumi?
No.
Joel?
I hope so.
A yes, a no, and I hope so. I think, well,
I
I'll
hope
end
so too. I hope so too. That we can agree on.
because I choose to live in as upbeat a frame of mind as possible.
Face-to-face talks.
But hope
Right.
is not a strategy. We need a strategy.
Right. Hope is not a strategy. I read that somewhere with respect to Iran just recently. I want to thank Joel and Sumi and Suzanne. It's really a pleasure to see three analysts, veterans of this issue that have so much authority and insight. And I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in and hopefully staying with us through the program. And I wish you all health and happiness until the next Carnegie Connect session. Thanks so much.
Thank you.